They found her beneath 6 feet of concrete, entombed in darkness for 67 years, clutching the one piece of evidence that would finally expose her killer. A glass jar with a faded label, a name whispered in fear for nearly 7 decades, and a secret so dark it had poisoned an entire town. March 2009. A heavy atmosphere hung over the abandoned Mayfield farm, about 12 miles from Grand Island, Nebraska. The beams from construction workers' headlamps cut through thick dust, landing on the cracked concrete of a World War II-era silo, a place that should have contained nothing but rubble and memories. The demolition crew had been working for 3 days, breaking through layers of old concrete, clearing the foundation for what was supposed to be a new housing development. The work was routine, mechanical, until it wasn't. Central. We've located an unusual object beneath the old silo foundation. Requesting the coroner's unit. The supervisor's voice crackled over the radio, piercing the thick spring silence of Nebraska. His hands shook as he held the radio. He'd been doing construction work for 23 years, had demolished dozens of old buildings, had seen plenty of strange things buried in foundations, but nothing like this, nothing that made his stomach turn and his breath catch in his throat. What began as a routine demolition job had just become something else entirely, something that would finally answer the question haunting Hall County for 67 years. A set of human remains lay buried beneath the concrete, skeletal, fragile, positioned carefully, almost tenderly, as if someone had taken great care in placing the body. And right beside those remains, untouched by time, a glass jar labeled Hedron and a rotted scrap of fabric that had once been pale blue. Items no one expected to find here. Items that had been missing since the summer of 1942. The same Hedron jar Helen Mayfield was said to have carried the day she vanished. If you're drawn to cold cases that refuse to stay buried, cases where justice waits decades to be served, cases that prove the truth always finds a way to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the Cold Case Desk. Your support brings these forgotten voices back into the light. Ring that notification bell, because what happens next in this story will leave you absolutely stunned. These are the stories that need to be told. These are the voices that deserve to be heard. And your engagement helps us continue this work. Let's solve these mysteries together. For nearly 7 decades, Helen's disappearance had been an unanswered void in the Grand Island community. A mystery that had consumed the town, divided families, destroyed friendships, and left a stain that never quite washed away. A quiet young woman who suddenly vanished while riding her bicycle home from church on a warm July evening. A house left with lights burning all night, as if waiting for someone to come home. A cup of tea that never had time to cool, sitting on the kitchen table beside a folded dish towel. And after that, absolute silence. No calls for help, no ransom notes, no body, just emptiness where a person used to be. The discovery beneath the Mayfield silo wasn't just the end of a missing persons case. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would unearth secrets buried for nearly 7 decades beneath the quiet Nebraska plains. Secrets that had festered in the darkness. Secrets that had shaped the lives of everyone who'd known Helen. Secrets that would finally, mercifully, come into the light. Because when authorities finally identified a suspect, and for the first time in the 2009 report put a name to the person responsible, it wasn't a stranger. Not a drifter passing through town on his way to somewhere else. Not a roadside predator who'd spotted an easy target. Not someone from outside the community. It was someone the entire community had trusted. Someone who had stood beside Helen in her final days, had spoken to her, had watched her, had desired her. Someone who had lived among them for more than half a century with a horrific secret buried right beneath the farm where he'd worked. Someone who had walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores, attended the same church services, and looked everyone in the eye while knowing exactly what he'd done. The Mayfield case isn't just a solved mystery. It's proof of the persistence of investigators who refused to let files gather dust in forgotten boxes, who believed that every victim deserves justice no matter how much time has passed. It's proof of modern forensic advances that gave a voice back to a victim who'd been silenced, who'd been buried, who'd been erased from the world. It's proof of the relentless efforts of those who still believe the truth would eventually come out, no matter how deeply it's buried, no matter how much time has passed, no matter how many people want it to stay hidden. It's also the story of a community torn apart, a town that lost its innocence on a summer night in 1942 and never quite got it back. When Helen vanished in 1942, suspicion spread like wildfire across the Nebraska prairie. It started as whispers in the general store, grew into accusations at church gatherings, and eventually became open hostility between neighbors who'd known each other for decades. People eyed each other warily, suspiciously, wondering who among them was capable of such evil. Some families stopped speaking altogether, relationships severed by suspicion and fear. Children were warned to stay away from certain houses, certain people, certain parts of town. The brief but desperate search for Helen exposed small cracks in the town's foundation, cracks that would eventually become chasms when the truth finally surfaced nearly 7 decades later. What makes this case especially haunting is this. The answer was always very close. Close enough to touch. Close enough to see. Close enough that if someone had looked just a little harder, dug just a little deeper, asked just one more question, Helen might have been found decades earlier. The prime suspect had appeared in the original investigation, had been questioned multiple times, had sat across from police in a cramped interrogation room, had answered every question with a calm voice and steady hands, and then melted back into ordinary life, as if he'd never been involved, as if he hadn't just committed murder and gotten away with it. For decades after that, that person attended Helen's memorial services, standing in the back of the church with his head bowed, his hands folded, his expression appropriately somber. He talked to neighbors about the old loss, shaking his head sadly, saying what a tragedy it was, wondering aloud what could have happened to poor Helen. He looked into the eyes of those who grieved the most. Helen's friends, Helen's family, the people who'd loved her and lost her, and he maintained an innocent facade while hiding a secret no one could have imagined. A secret that would have destroyed him if it had been discovered. A secret he carried to his grave. Tonight, we're going back to the summer of 1942, tracing Helen Mayfield's final footsteps through a town that no longer exists in the same form, and seeing how one quiet disappearance became one of the most shocking cold cases in Nebraska history. We're going to walk the same roads Helen walked, see the same sights she saw, and try to understand what happened on that July night, when everything changed. This is a story of loss and loneliness, of deception and darkness, of relentless pursuit and unwavering determination, and of justice delayed but never denied. Summer of 1942. Nebraska was drenched in the gold of corn and the smell of cracked, dry earth. The heat pressed down on the plains like a heavy blanket, making everything feel slow and dreamlike. The whole state was feeling the effects of the war that had engulfed the world. Young men had gone to the front, shipped off to Europe and the Pacific, leaving small towns to be run by women and the elderly, and those too young or too old to fight. It was a strange time, a time of absence and worry, a time when every telegram delivered by the Western Union boy sent a chill through the community, when every knock on the door might bring news that would change a family forever. Grand Island, in the heart of the plains, was one such community. A town of about 10,000 people, most of them farmers or connected to farming in some way. Dusty roads winding past farms, where corn grew tall and wheat swayed in the wind. A train whistle echoing every morning at 6 o'clock, so regular you could set your watch by it. Weathered wooden houses with tin roofs standing silent in the hot wind, their paint peeling, their porches sagging slightly from years of Nebraska winters and summers. Main Street had a general store, a post office, a small diner that served coffee and pie, and St. Paul's Lutheran Church, where most of the town gathered every Sunday morning and evening. The Mayfield farm sat isolated on the southern edge of town, about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by cornfields that created a natural barrier between the house and the rest of the world. It was a small property, maybe 40 acres, with a simple 2-story farmhouse that had been built in the 1920s. The paint was white once, but had faded to a grayish color. There was a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a chicken coop, and the old silo that would eventually become Helen's tomb. Helen Mayfield lived there alone. She was 28 years old in the summer of 1942. a widow since her husband, a railroad engineer named Robert Mayfield, was killed in Europe in 1941. He'd enlisted early, before Pearl Harbor, driven by a sense of duty and adventure. He'd written letters home describing the English countryside, the food, the people he'd met, and then the letters stopped. In November of 1941, Helen received a telegram informing her that Robert had been killed in action. No details, just those stark, horrible words. Killed in action. Helen had taken the news quietly. She didn't scream or collapse. She simply folded the telegram carefully, placed it in a drawer, and continued with her day. But something inside her had broken. Neighbors noticed the change. She became more withdrawn, more isolated, more ghost-like. She spoke less. She smiled rarely. She moved through the world as if she wasn't quite part of it anymore. Helen rarely went out after Robert's death, only to church every Sunday morning and evening, and to the general store once a week to buy flour and sugar and coffee. People said she was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you uncomfortable, the kind that feels like it might shatter if you speak too loudly, the kind who only smiled when neighborhood kids passed by on their bicycles, waving at her, and even then the smile never quite reached her eyes. She had no family in Grand Island. Her parents had died when she was young, and she'd been raised by an aunt in Iowa who'd passed away before the war. Robert had been her whole world, and when he died, that world collapsed. On July 17, 1942, a Friday evening, the evening service at St. Paul's Lutheran ended just before 8 o'clock. It was still light outside, the sun hanging low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. The service had been brief, maybe 40 minutes, focused on prayer for the boys overseas. The congregation was small that evening, maybe 30 people, mostly women and older men. Helen sat in the back pew, where she always sat, her Bible open in her lap, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the altar. She spoke to no one before the service. She spoke to no one after. She quietly slipped out before the choir sang the final hymn, as she often did, uncomfortable with the social interaction that came after services ended. A few people saw her pedaling her old bicycle down the dirt road toward the farm, her pale blue dress billowing slightly in the evening breeze, her brown hair pinned back neatly, her posture straight and proper even as she rode. Her bicycle was old, probably from the 1920s, with rust on the handlebars and a wicker basket attached to the front. She moved slowly, not in a hurry, just a woman heading home after church. The image of her growing smaller against the sunset would haunt those witnesses for the rest of their lives. When full darkness fell around 9:30, the lights in Helen's little house were still on, visible from the road, visible from half a mile away. Ruth Keading, the community nurse and Helen's nearest neighbor, saw the glow flickering through the corn as she prepared for bed. Ruth was 45 years old, a practical woman who delivered half the babies in Hall County and tended to the sick and dying with equal efficiency. She noticed the lights because she always noticed the lights. She'd been keeping an eye on Helen since Robert's death, worried about the young widow living alone, checking in on her periodically, bringing her food occasionally, making sure she was eating and sleeping, and taking care of herself. Ruth assumed Helen was reading, as she often did. Helen loved books. She'd read by lamplight for hours, losing herself in novels and poetry, escaping into worlds that were kinder than the one she lived in. So Ruth thought nothing of the lights. She went to bed, expecting everything to be normal in the morning. But by midnight, the light still hadn't gone out. Ruth happened to wake around midnight to use the bathroom, and she glanced out the window toward the Mayfield farm. The light was still on. Unusual. Helen was usually in bed by 10 o'clock. But Ruth told herself that Helen was probably having trouble sleeping, that she was reading late, that everything was fine. She went back to bed. The next morning, Saturday, July 18th, Ruth woke early as always. She made coffee and looked out the window toward the Mayfield farm. The light was still on. Now Ruth felt a prickle of concern. She waited until 7 o'clock, then decided to walk over and check on Helen. It was a hot morning already, the sun beating down, grasshoppers chirping in the fields. Ruth walked the half-mile to the Mayfield farm, following the narrow dirt path that cut through the corn. As she approached the house, she called out, "Helen! Helen! Are you home?" No answer. She called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The front door was ajar, standing open about 6 inches, which was strange because Helen always kept her doors locked. Always. She was careful about that, especially living alone. Ruth pushed the door open slowly, her heart starting to beat faster. Hello? Helen? It's Ruth. Are you here? Silence. Ruth stepped inside. The house was neat. Too neat. Everything in its place. Not a dish out of place in the kitchen. Not a book left open on a chair. Not a single sign of disorder. But it felt wrong, empty, hollow. The bicycle was propped neatly on the porch, exactly where Helen always left it. Her Sunday hat was hanging on the hook by the door. Her shoes, the ones she wore to church, were placed carefully by the entrance. On the kitchen table sat a cold cup of tea, the liquid long since gone cold, a thin film on its surface. Beside it, a folded dish towel. A book lay open on the nightstand in the bedroom upstairs, a bookmark placed carefully between the pages. The bed was made with military precision, the corners tucked tightly, the pillow fluffed and centered. Helen's nightgown was folded on the chair by the window. Ruth called out several times as she walked through the rooms, her voice echoing in the empty house. She checked every room, the parlor, the kitchen, the bedroom, the small bathroom. Helen wasn't there. Ruth stood in the empty living room, and a cold, unmistakable feeling of wrongness settled over her. Something terrible had happened. She could feel it in her bones. Helen Mayfield had vanished. Ruth ran back to her house and called the sheriff's office from the party line telephone. Within hours, word spread through Grand Island like smoke through a barn. By noon, half the town knew that Helen Mayfield was missing. By evening, everyone knew. Sheriff Walter Gaines was 54 years old. A heavy-set man with a graying mustache and decades of experience handling the kinds of problems that arose in small farming communities. Cattle thieves, bar fights, the occasional domestic dispute. He'd never dealt with a missing person before. Not like this. Not someone who simply vanished without a trace. Gaines arrived at the Mayfield farm by noon on Saturday, bringing 2 deputies with him. They walked through the house slowly, methodically, taking notes in small leather books, their boots echoing on the wooden floors. Everything was in place. Too much in place. The bed was made with military precision. Dishes were stacked and dried beside the sink. A book lay open on the nightstand, a bookmark placed carefully between the pages. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was missing. Except Helen. Sheriff Gaines questioned Ruth Keading first, sitting with her at her kitchen table while one of his deputies took notes. Ruth told him everything, about the lights that stayed on all night, about the open door, about the cold tea on the table. She mentioned that Helen had seemed nervous lately, more nervous than usual, looking over her shoulder more often, jumping at unexpected sounds. But Ruth had chalked it up to the loneliness of living alone during wartime, to the grief of losing her husband, to the natural anxiety that came with being a woman alone on an isolated farm. Did she have enemies? Gaines asked, his pen poised over his notebook. Ruth shook her head. Helen didn't have enemies. How could she? She barely interacted with anyone. She kept to herself, lived quietly, bothered no one. She was the least threatening person Ruth had ever known. What about men? Gaines pressed, leaning forward slightly. Was there anyone who'd taken an interest in her? Anyone who'd been coming around? Ruth hesitated, her hands tightened around her coffee cup. There was someone, she said finally. Thomas Carver, a farmhand, who worked the neighboring property, the Pritchard farm. He'd been seen talking to Helen a few times near the church, always lingering a little too long after services ended, always watching her a little too closely when she rode past on her bicycle. But Helen had never encouraged him. In fact, she'd mentioned to Ruth once, just a few weeks earlier, that Thomas made her uncomfortable, that he stared at her, that he found excuses to be wherever she was. Sheriff Gaines made a note and moved on. Tell me about the night she disappeared. Did you see or hear anything unusual? Ruth thought for a moment. No, nothing unusual. Just the lights. I saw her ride past my house around 8:15, heading home from church. I waved, but I don't think she saw me. And then later, around 9:30, I saw the lights on in her house. I thought she was reading. That's all. By nightfall on Saturday, a search party had formed. 20 men with lanterns and hunting dogs spread out across the Mayfield property and into the surrounding fields. They searched the corn rows, pushing through the tall stalks, calling Helen's name. They searched the irrigation ditches, wading through muddy water up to their knees. They searched the abandoned barns that dotted the landscape, old structures left over from farms that had failed during the Depression. They called her name until their voices went hoarse, until the words became ragged and desperate. Helen! Helen Mayfield! The dogs picked up a scent near the old silo, the one that hadn't been used in years, the one with the cracked concrete foundation. They circled it several times, whining, scratching at the ground. But then they lost the scent at the edge of the property line, near where the Mayfield land met the road. The handlers tried to pick it up again, but it was gone, as if Helen had simply vanished into thin air. Nothing. No sign of her. No clothing. No blood. No indication of what had happened. The next day, Sunday, they expanded the search. 50 men this time, organized into teams, combing through every inch of land within a 5-mile radius of the Mayfield farm. They dragged the pond behind the Johnson farm, pulling up nothing but mud and old tires. They checked the rail yards, thinking maybe Helen had tried to catch a train to somewhere else, trying to escape her grief, trying to start over somewhere new. They questioned everyone who'd been at the church service on Friday evening, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual, anything suspicious, anything at all. Still nothing. Helen Mayfield had simply disappeared, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. By the end of the week, the search had stalled. The volunteers were exhausted. The dogs had lost the scent. There were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence, just an empty house and a woman who no longer existed. Sheriff Gaines turned his attention to Thomas Carver. Thomas was 24 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from years of hard physical labor. He had calloused hands from working the fields, a permanent squint from years of working in the sun, and a quiet intensity that made people uncomfortable. He'd moved to Grand Island 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1939, from somewhere in Iowa. Though no one knew much about his past, he didn't talk about where he'd come from or why he'd left. He kept to himself, worked hard from sunrise to sunset, and didn't cause trouble. He lived in a small shack on the Pritchard farm, just 2 miles from the Mayfield property, a one-room structure with a wood stove and a cot and not much else. When Gaines brought him in for questioning on Monday morning, Thomas seemed calm. Too calm, some people would later say. Too composed for someone being questioned about a missing woman. He sat in the interrogation room with his hands folded on the table, his expression neutral, his eyes steady. "Where were you on the night of July 17th?" Gaines asked, opening his notebook. Thomas said he'd been home, alone. He'd finished work around 6 o'clock, eaten a cold supper of bread and cheese and an apple, and gone to bed early because he had to be up before dawn the next morning. He had no witnesses, no alibi, nothing to prove where he'd been. "Did you know Helen Mayfield?" Gaines asked. Thomas nodded slowly. Sure, he knew her. Everyone knew her. Small town. You know how it is. "Did you ever talk to her?" "Sometimes. At church. Maybe once or twice at the general store. Nothing unusual. Just pleasantries." "Did you have feelings for her?" Gaines pressed, watching Thomas's face carefully. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. Finally, he said, "She was a nice woman. That's all." "People saw you watching her," Gaines said, his voice harder now. "Following her, staring at her. What were you doing?" Thomas's hands tightened on the table. "I wasn't following anyone. I was just, I don't know, noticing her. She was pretty. Is that a crime?" "It might be," Gaines said, leaning forward. "If you did something to her." Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound. "I didn't do anything to her. I don't know where she is. I wish I did, but I don't. I hope you find her. I really do. But I had nothing to do with her disappearance." Gaines let him go. There was no evidence, no body, no witnesses, no physical proof linking Thomas to Helen's disappearance. Just suspicion, and that wasn't enough to hold him. In 1942, You couldn't arrest someone based on gut feeling. You needed evidence. As the days turned into weeks, the town's focus shifted. The initial urgency faded. Life went on. People returned to their routines, their jobs, their families. But the mystery remained, hanging over Grand Island like a cloud that never quite dissipated. Rumors began to circulate. Some people said Helen had run away, that she'd been secretly involved with a married man and fled to avoid scandal. Others whispered about foul play, pointing fingers at Thomas Carver, at drifters who sometimes passed through town, at anyone who seemed even slightly suspicious. Some suggested she'd taken her own life, that the grief of losing her husband had become too much to bear, that she'd wandered into the fields and died somewhere no one would find her. The Mayfield farm fell into disrepair. The cornfields went unplanted. The house stood empty, its windows like hollow eyes staring out at nothing. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live there. It became a ghost itself, a monument to an unsolved mystery, a place children dared each other to approach on Halloween, a place that carried a sense of wrongness that never went away. And Helen Mayfield became a ghost too, fading from daily conversation, slipping into legend, becoming one of those stories people told when they wanted to frighten each other or remind themselves that bad things could happen anywhere, even in a quiet town in the middle of Nebraska. But some people never forgot. Some people carried the mystery with them for the rest of their lives. Ruth Keading never stopped believing that something terrible had happened to her neighbor. She kept Helen's story alive, telling it to anyone who would listen, bringing it up at church gatherings, at community meetings, at the general store. She wrote letters to the state police, demanding that they reopen the case, insisting that Helen hadn't just run away, that something awful had happened, that someone in town knew something. For years, those letters went unanswered. The state police had bigger problems, a war to worry about, real crimes with real evidence. They couldn't spare resources for a missing person case with no leads. Thomas Carver left Grand Island in the spring of 1943, just 10 months after Helen disappeared. He gave no explanation. He simply collected his final paycheck from the Pritchard farm, packed his few belongings, and left town on a bus, heading west. Some people said his departure was proof of guilt. Why would an innocent man run? But others argued that he'd probably just gotten tired of the suspicion, tired of the whispers, tired of being looked at like a criminal every time he walked down the street. Whatever the reason, Thomas Carver was gone, and with him went any hope of solving the case. The years passed. The 1940s gave way to the 50s. The war ended. Soldiers came home. Some of them were broken by what they'd seen, unable to readjust to normal life. Others married their sweethearts and started families and tried to forget. Grand Island grew slowly. New houses were built. New businesses opened. The town changed, but the memory of Helen Mayfield lingered. Ruth Keading grew older but never gave up. She kept a file on Helen's case, collecting newspaper clippings, witness statements, anything she could find. She believed that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. In 1968, Ruth wrote another letter to the state police. She was 68 years old by then, her hands shaking slightly as she wrote, her eyesight failing. But her determination hadn't dimmed. She described everything she remembered about Helen's disappearance. The lights that stayed on all night, the cold tea on the table, the open door. She mentioned Thomas Carver again, insisting that he should be questioned, that he knew something. The letter was filed away. No response came. In 1985, Ruth tried again. She was 85 years old, living in a small apartment in town, her health declining. She wrote to the FBI this time, asking them to investigate. She included copies of all her notes, all her collected evidence, everything she'd saved over the years. Again, no response. Ruth Keading died in 1992, at the age of 92. She died without ever knowing what happened to Helen, without ever seeing justice served. But she never stopped believing. Meanwhile, Thomas Carver had moved west after leaving Grand Island. He drifted from town to town, state to state, working odd jobs. He'd been a farmhand in Colorado, a construction worker in Wyoming, a janitor in Montana. He never stayed anywhere long, never put down roots, never formed close relationships. He married once, briefly. In 1956, to a woman named Margaret in Billings, Montana. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. No children. Margaret filed for divorce, citing emotional distance and refusing to elaborate further. Thomas signed the papers without argument. He lived alone after that, in a series of small apartments and boarding houses, working just enough to get by, keeping to himself, never drawing attention. If anyone from his past had been looking for him, they wouldn't have found him. He'd become invisible, just another aging man in a world full of them. In 1997, at the age of 78, Thomas Carver died in a nursing home in Billings, Montana. He'd been there for 3 years, suffering from emphysema and heart disease, the result of decades of smoking and hard living. He died alone. No family at his bedside, no friends to mourn him. He was buried in a simple grave in a small cemetery outside Billings, marked with a plain headstone that listed only his name and dates. The funeral was attended by no one, and for another 12 years, his secret remained buried. Then, in March 2009, everything changed. The Mayfield property had been sold in 2008 to a development company called Prairie Homes LLC. They had plans to build a small housing complex on the land, 6 modest homes for young families, taking advantage of the relatively cheap land on the edge of Grand Island. But first, they needed to clear the old structures. The barn had already been torn down. The farmhouse had been demolished the previous month. Now it was time to deal with the silo. The silo was a problem. It was old, probably dating back to the 1930s or 40s, built when the farm was more productive. The concrete was cracked and crumbling, and the structure was leaning dangerously. It needed to come down before construction could begin. On March 12, 2009, a demolition crew arrived at 7 in the morning. 5 men with jackhammers and excavators and all the equipment needed to break through decades of concrete. The foreman, a man named Dale Morrison, had been doing this work for 23 years. He'd demolished hundreds of old buildings, had torn down silos and barns and warehouses. It was routine work, loud and dusty and physically demanding, but routine. They started at the top, breaking through the upper sections of the silo, working their way down. By noon, they'd made good progress. By 3 in the afternoon, they were working on the foundation, the thick concrete base that had been poured decades earlier. Dale was operating the jackhammer himself, working methodically, breaking the concrete into manageable chunks that could be hauled away. And then his jackhammer hit something that wasn't concrete. Dale stopped. He shut off the machine and bent down, brushing away dust and debris. There was something there, something that didn't belong. He called over one of his crew members, a young guy named Marcus. "What is that?" Marcus asked, peering into the hole they'd created. "I don't know," Dale said. "But I don't think we should keep digging." They cleared away more debris carefully, using their hands now instead of tools. And slowly, horribly, the shape of a human skeleton emerged from the darkness, lying on its side in a fetal position, as if the person had curled up to sleep and never woken. The bones were fragile, yellowed with age, but intact. And beside the skeleton, untouched by time, a glass jar with a faded label that read, "Hedrin," and a scrap of fabric that had once been pale blue. Dale stood up slowly, his legs shaking. He'd found plenty of strange things in demolition work over the years. Old bottles, coins, tools left behind by previous workers. But never this. Never human remains. He pulled out his radio with trembling hands. "Central, we've located an unusual object beneath the old silo foundation. Requesting the coroner's unit." The response came immediately. "Can you describe the object?" Dale swallowed hard. "It's a body. A skeleton. Human. And some personal effects. We need the coroner here now." Within 30 minutes, the site was swarming with police and emergency personnel. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape. The coroner, Dr. Sarah Brennan, arrived within the hour, bringing her team of forensic specialists. News crews showed up shortly after, their vans lining the road, cameras pointed at the old silo. Dr. Brennan was in her late 40s, a meticulous professional who'd worked dozens of cases involving remains. She approached the excavation site carefully, documenting everything with photographs before she even touched the skeleton. She worked for hours, using brushes and small tools to carefully expose the remains fully, to map their position, to collect every scrap of evidence. The skeleton was female, based on the pelvic structure and skull characteristics, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall. Age at death, estimated between 25 and 30 years old. The bones showed signs of having been buried for a very long time, possibly decades. And there was something else. A fracture to the back of the skull, a clear, depressed fracture consistent with blunt force trauma. This woman hadn't died of natural causes. She'd been murdered. The glass jar was carefully removed and placed in an evidence bag. The label, though faded, was still legible. Hedron, a brand of cold medicine popular in the 1930s and 40s. The fabric, now barely holding together, had once been a dress, pale blue, based on the traces of dye still visible. And beneath the skeleton, they found something else. A small leather wallet, preserved by the dry conditions beneath the concrete. Inside, a driver's license. Helen Marie Mayfield, born April 3, 1914. Hair, brown. Eyes, blue. Height, 5 feet 4 inches. Dr. Brennan stood up slowly, holding the wallet in her gloved hands. She looked at the sheriff's deputy standing nearby. "We need to notify the state police," she said quietly. "This is Helen Mayfield, the woman who disappeared in 1942. The discovery made national news within hours. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all the major networks picked up the story. For a small town like Grand Island, it was seismic. It was the biggest news to hit the area in decades, maybe ever. Reporters descended on the town like locusts, interviewing anyone who would talk, anyone who remembered the original case, or had family members who remembered. Old photographs of Helen were dug out of archives and displayed on television screens across the country. Her wedding photo, standing beside Robert in 1938, both of them young and smiling, unaware of what the future held. Her high school graduation photo, serious and composed, her hair pinned back neatly. The last known photograph of her, taken at a church picnic in the summer of 1941, standing alone at the edge of the frame, looking off at something beyond the camera's view. And the investigation, dormant for 67 years, roared back to life. Detective Marcus Holt was assigned to lead the case. He was 42 years old, a seasoned investigator with the Nebraska State Police who'd built a reputation for solving cold cases using modern forensic techniques. He'd solved a 1978 murder in Omaha using DNA evidence. He'd closed a 1985 abduction case using cell phone tower data. He approached the Mayfield case with a mix of determination and skepticism. 67 years was a long time, a very long time. Evidence degrades over decades. Witnesses die. Memories fade like old photographs left in the sun. Physical evidence crumbles. Paper turns to dust. But Holt had something the original investigators didn't have. He had DNA. The remains were sent to a state forensic laboratory in Omaha on March 15, 2009. Using advanced techniques that hadn't existed even 10 years earlier, technicians were able to extract usable DNA from Helen's bones. The process was painstaking, requiring extreme care and precision. They worked with samples from the femur, which typically preserve DNA better than other bones. They used specialized extraction methods, carefully separating the ancient DNA from contamination, amplifying the genetic material until they had a complete profile. But they also found something unexpected, something that changed everything. Epithelial cells under Helen's fingernails, skin cells, preserved by the dry conditions in the sealed concrete tomb. Helen had fought back. She'd scratched her attacker, and in doing so, she'd captured his DNA under her nails, holding it there for 67 years, waiting for someone to find it. The DNA was run through CODIS, the National Criminal Database that contains DNA profiles from convicted criminals across the United States. Holt waited anxiously for the results, hoping for a match, hoping this would be simple. But when the results came back on March 23rd, there was no match. The killer wasn't in the system. Either he'd never been convicted of a crime, or he'd died before DNA collection became standard practice. Holt wasn't discouraged. If the killer wasn't in the system, maybe he was still alive. Maybe he'd left descendants. Maybe, Just maybe, Holt could use genetic genealogy to track him down. Genetic genealogy was a relatively new tool in law enforcement, made famous by cases like the Golden State Killer, where investigators used public DNA databases to identify a serial killer who'd evaded capture for decades. By uploading DNA to public genealogy databases, investigators could identify distant relatives of an unknown suspect and build a family tree, eventually narrowing down to the person of interest. It was revolutionary. It was controversial. And it worked. Holt contacted a genetic genealogist named Barbara Chen, a specialist who'd worked on several high-profile cold cases. Barbara was in her 50s, a former biology professor who'd become fascinated with using DNA to solve crimes. She agreed to take on the Mayfield case pro bono, moved by Helen's story, determined to help bring closure. On April 1, 2009, Barbara uploaded the DNA profile from Helen's fingernails to GEDmatch, a public database used by amateur genealogists trying to trace their ancestry. Within days, she had a hit. A third cousin match. Someone who shared a great-great-grandparent with the unknown killer. From there, Barbara began the painstaking work of building a family tree. She pored over census records from the late 1800s and early 1900s. She examined birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, military records. She traced lineages back through multiple generations, identifying branches of the family that had lived in or near Grand Island in 1942. She worked 16-hour days, building spreadsheets and charts and diagrams, connecting dots that had been separated by time and distance. It took 3 weeks of intensive research, 3 weeks of following leads and eliminating possibilities, and slowly, methodically narrowing down the suspect pool. And then, on April 22nd, a name emerged from the genealogical fog: Thomas James Carver, born May 12, 1918, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Moved to Grand Island, Nebraska, in 1939. Worked as a farmhand on the Pritchard farm. Left Grand Island in 1943. Last known address: Billings, Montana. Holt felt a chill run down his spine when he saw the name. Thomas Carver. The same man Sheriff Walter Gaines had questioned 67 years ago. The same man who'd been seen watching Helen, lingering near her, making her uncomfortable. The same man who'd had no alibi for the night Helen disappeared. The same man who'd seemed too calm during interrogation, too composed, too ready with his answers. The same man who'd left town just months after Helen vanished, running from suspicion, running from guilt, running from the truth. Holt dug deeper into Thomas Carver's history. He obtained military records, employment records, anything he could find. Thomas had never been in the military, had been classified 4F during the war due to flat feet and poor eyesight. He'd worked as a farmhand in Colorado from 1944 to 1947. He'd moved to Wyoming in 1948, working construction. Then Montana in 1952, where he'd stayed for the rest of his life, drifting between jobs, never settling down, never forming lasting relationships. Holt found the marriage record. Thomas Carver married Margaret Louise Patterson on June 7, 1956, in Billings, Montana. Divorced January 14, 1958. No children. Margaret was still alive, living in a retirement community in Bozeman. Holt drove there on April 25 to interview her. Margaret was 82 years old. Her memory still sharp, her voice steady. She'd remarried in 1965 to a man who died in 2003. She had 2 children from that marriage, 5 grandchildren, a life that had moved on from her brief time with Thomas Carver. "What can you tell me about Thomas?" Holt asked, sitting across from her in the community's visiting room. Margaret sighed, her hands folded in her lap. "That was a long time ago. A lifetime ago, really. I was 28 when I met him. He was working as a janitor at the hospital where I was a nurse. He seemed nice at first. Quiet, reserved. But there was something about him that made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it then, but looking back, I think it was the emptiness in his eyes. Like there was nothing behind them." "What do you mean?" Holt pressed gently. "He never talked about his past," Margaret said. "Never mentioned family, friends, where he'd come from. It was like his life had started the day he arrived in Billings, and he had nightmares. Terrible nightmares. He'd wake up screaming sometimes, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. But he'd never tell me what the nightmares were about. He'd just say he didn't remember. But I think he did remember. I think he was haunted by something. Something he'd done. Did he ever mention anyone named Helen? Holt asked. Margaret thought for a moment, her brow furrowing. Helen. No, I don't think so. But there was one time. Maybe 6 months after we were married. We were watching television, some crime show where they were looking for a missing woman. Thomas got very upset. He turned off the television and left the room. I found him outside later, sitting on the porch, his head in his hands. I asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. But I could see he was crying. I'd never seen him cry before or after. Just that once. Holt made notes. Did he ever hurt you? Margaret shook her head. No. He never laid a hand on me. But the emotional distance, the walls he put up, the secrets he kept. It was like being married to a ghost. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I filed for divorce. He signed the papers without argument. I never saw him again after that. Holt thanked her for her time and left. As he drove back to Grand Island, he felt certain he had his killer. But Thomas Carver had died in 1997, 12 years earlier. There would be no arrest, no trial, no day in court where Helen's family could face him and demand answers. But there could still be justice. There could still be truth. There could still be closure. Holt requested that Thomas Carver's body be exhumed from the cemetery outside Billings. It was a long shot. The man had been dead for 12 years, buried in a simple casket in the ground. Decomposition and time would have taken their toll. But Montana's cold, dry climate might have preserved the remains well enough to extract DNA. It was worth trying. The exhumation took place on May 7, 2009, on a gray morning with heavy clouds hanging low over the mountains. A small crew of technicians, a county coroner, and Detective Holt stood by as a backhoe carefully opened the grave. The casket was lifted from the ground, covered in dirt, its wood darkened and weathered but still intact. They transported it to a forensic facility in Billings. Inside, Thomas Carver's remains were remarkably well preserved. The cold, dry climate had slowed decomposition significantly. Soft tissue had mummified in places. The skeleton was intact. And most importantly, there was enough preserved bone to extract DNA. Bone samples were carefully taken from the femur and sent to the forensic laboratory in Omaha. The lab technicians worked quickly but carefully, knowing how important this case was, knowing that the entire state was watching, knowing that a 67-year-old murder case hinged on their work. 3 weeks later, on May 28, the results came back. Holt was in his office when the call came. He picked up the phone, his heart pounding. Detective Holt, this is Dr. Amanda Reeves from the Omaha lab. We have your results. And? There was a pause. Then, it's a perfect match. The DNA from Thomas Carver's remains matches the DNA we found under Helen Mayfield's fingernails. 16 marker match. There's no doubt. Thomas Carver killed Helen Mayfield. Holt closed his eyes and took a deep breath. After 67 years, they finally had proof. Irrefutable, scientific proof that Thomas Carver had murdered Helen Mayfield in July of 1942 and buried her beneath the silo where he'd worked. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Your engagement means the world to the Cold Case Desk, and it helps us bring more forgotten cases like Helen's back into the light. These stories matter. These voices deserve to be heard, and your support makes it possible. The confirmation sent shockwaves through Grand Island. The news spread rapidly, carried by television, radio, newspapers, and social media. For those who'd lived through the original disappearance, for those whose parents or grandparents had searched for Helen in the summer of 1942, it was vindication. The suspicions had been right. Thomas Carver had been guilty all along. He'd sat in that interrogation room and lied to Sheriff Gaines. He'd walked among them for nearly a year with blood on his hands. He'd attended memorial services and looked people in the eye and pretended to care while knowing exactly what he'd done and where Helen's body was buried. Ruth Keading's daughter, Elizabeth, now 67 years old, wept when Detective Holt told her the news. Her mother had died 17 years earlier without ever knowing the truth. But she'd been right. She'd been right all along. Something terrible had happened to Helen, and Thomas Carver had been responsible. But for others in the community, it was devastating. There were people in Grand Island who'd known Thomas, people who'd worked with him, talked to him, considered him a friend. Learning that he'd been a murderer, that he'd walked among them with such a horrific secret, that he'd fooled them all, was almost too much to bear. It made them question their own judgment. If they'd been wrong about Thomas, what else had they been wrong about? Who else might be hiding secrets? Detective Holt scheduled a press conference for June 2nd, 2009. The conference was held at the Grand Island Police Department. In a room that was far too small for the number of reporters who showed up, cameras lined the back wall. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, notebooks ready, microphones extended. The energy in the room was electric. Holt stood at the podium, a wall of microphones in front of him, and laid out the evidence in meticulous detail. He explained the discovery of the remains beneath the silo. He described the DNA extraction process, the genetic genealogy work, the identification of Thomas Carver as a suspect. He detailed the exhumation and the final DNA match that confirmed Carver's guilt. He spoke for 30 minutes without interruption, walking through every step of the investigation, ensuring that everyone understood how the case had been solved. "This case is officially closed," Holt said finally, his voice steady and clear. Helen Mayfield was murdered by Thomas James Carver on the evening of July 17, 1942. Based on our investigation, we believe Carver followed Helen home from church, approached her at her residence, and when she rejected his advances, he struck her in the back of the head with a blunt object, likely a shovel. Helen fought back, scratching his face or arms, capturing his DNA under her fingernails. Carver then buried her body beneath the silo foundation and covered it with concrete to ensure it would never be discovered. Helen's remains have been released to her family for proper burial. Justice has been a long time coming, but it has finally arrived. Reporters shouted questions immediately, their voices overlapping. Why did he do it? Holt held up a hand for quiet. We may never know his exact motive. Carver is dead. He can't answer for his crimes. But based on witness statements from 1942, we believe Carver had an unhealthy obsession with Helen Mayfield. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him, watching her, following her, lingering near her. Helen herself told a friend that Carver made her uncomfortable. We believe that on the night of July 17th, Carver's obsession reached a breaking point. When Helen rejected him, he killed her. How did he get away with it for so long? Holt paused, choosing his words carefully. He was careful. He was methodical. He buried her body in a place no one would think to look, beneath concrete, in a structure that was rarely used. He left town before suspicion could harden into evidence, and he lived the rest of his life in relative anonymity, moving from place to place, never drawing attention to himself, never giving anyone reason to look into his past. In many ways, he was the perfect killer. He planned it, he executed it, and he got away with it for 67 years, until technology caught up with him, until we developed the tools to extract DNA from decades-old evidence, until genetic genealogy gave us the ability to identify suspects even after they're dead. The press conference lasted another 20 minutes, with Holt fielding questions about the investigation, about Helen's family, about what would happen next. Finally, he stepped away from the podium, emotionally exhausted but satisfied. He'd done what he'd set out to do. He'd solved a 67-year-old murder. He'd given Helen Mayfield a voice. He'd brought justice to a woman who'd been silenced in the summer of 1942. Over the following weeks, more details emerged as investigators continued to piece together the events of that July night. They re-interviewed people who'd known both Helen and Thomas, many of them now in their 80s and 90s, their memories fragile but still present. And slowly, a clearer picture emerged of what had happened. Several witnesses who'd been teenagers in 1942 came forward with new information. One man, now 84 years old, remembered passing Thomas Carver on the road near the Mayfield farm around 9 o'clock on the evening of July 17th. He'd been riding his bicycle home from a friend's house when he'd seen Thomas walking away from the direction of the Mayfield property. Thomas's clothes had been dirty, his face flushed and sweaty, despite the evening heat having cooled. The witness hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Thomas was a farmhand. Dirty clothes were normal. But now, looking back, the memory took on a sinister significance. Another witness, a woman now 86, recalled seeing Thomas standing outside St. Paul's Lutheran on the night Helen disappeared. She'd been leaving the service with her mother when she'd noticed Thomas standing in the shadows near the church entrance, watching as Helen rode away on her bicycle. She remembered the look on his face. Intense. Hungry. Almost predatory. It had made her uncomfortable enough that she'd mentioned it to her mother, but her mother had brushed it off, telling her not to judge people, that Thomas was probably just waiting for someone. These details, insignificant at the time, invisible to the investigators in 1942, now formed a damning narrative. Thomas had been stalking Helen, watching her, waiting for his moment, and on July 17th, he'd finally acted. The reconstruction of events went like this. Thomas had attended the evening service at St. Paul's Lutheran, sitting in the back, watching Helen throughout the service. When the service ended and Helen slipped out early, Thomas had followed her at a distance, waiting until she was away from other witnesses. He'd watched her ride her bicycle down the dirt road toward home, her pale blue dress visible in the fading light. He'd waited perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, giving her time to get home, then he'd followed the same route. He'd arrived at the Mayfield farm around 8:30 or 8:45. Helen had been inside, probably making tea, settling in for the evening. Thomas had knocked on the door. Helen, recognizing him, had probably been wary but not immediately alarmed. This was still a time when people didn't lock their doors, when a neighbor stopping by wasn't unusual. She'd opened the door. Thomas had probably tried to talk to her, to express his feelings, to convince her to give him a chance, but Helen had rejected him. Firmly, clearly. Perhaps she'd even told him to leave, that he was making her uncomfortable, that he needed to stop following her. And Thomas, unable to accept that rejection, unable to control his rage and frustration, had struck her. The weapon was likely a shovel or a heavy piece of wood, something he'd grabbed from the porch or the yard. A single blow to the back of the head, as Helen turned away from him, trying to close the door, trying to protect herself. The blow had fractured her skull, killing her almost instantly. Helen had fought in those final moments. She'd turned, had raised her hands, had scratched at her attacker's face or arms, her fingernails drawing blood, capturing skin cells that would eventually damn him, but it hadn't been enough. She'd fallen. And Thomas, realizing what he'd done, had panicked. He'd stood there in the doorway, his victim at his feet, trying to figure out what to do. He couldn't leave her there. Someone would find her. He'd be caught. He'd be hanged. He needed to hide the body somewhere it would never be found. The silo. The thought had probably come to him quickly. The old World War II-era silo on the property. The one that was never used anymore. The one hidden by corn. The one with a concrete foundation. If he buried her there, beneath the concrete, no one would ever find her. He'd carried Helen's body across the property, probably throwing her over his shoulder, moving quickly through the darkness. The glass jar, the Hedron jar she'd been carrying in her pocket, had fallen out during the journey. Thomas had picked it up and tossed it aside, not thinking about evidence, not thinking about how it might connect Helen to this location decades later. He'd been focused only on hiding the body. At the silo, he dug a shallow grave in the dirt floor, working quickly, sweating, terrified that someone would see him. He'd placed Helen's body in the grave, positioning her on her side in a fetal position, almost gently, as if some part of him still cared about her even after what he'd done. He'd covered her with dirt and rubble. Then he'd found bags of cement mix that were stored in the silo, mixing the concrete with water from a nearby irrigation line, pouring it over the grave, sealing Helen in darkness. It had probably taken him most of the night. By the time he finished, it was likely close to dawn. He'd cleaned himself up as best he could, gone back to his shack, and crawled into bed. And when the search began the next morning, he'd joined in, helping to look for the woman he'd killed, playing the role of concerned neighbor, hiding in plain sight. For a year, he'd maintained that facade. He'd answered Sheriff Gaines's questions calmly, had looked Ruth Keading in the eye and pretended to care, had attended the memorial services and bowed his head in false prayer. And then, When the suspicion became too much, when he felt the walls closing in, he'd left. He'd run. He'd spent the next 54 years moving from place to place, never settling, never forming real connections, always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for someone to knock on his door and place him under arrest. But no one ever came. The technology didn't exist yet. The evidence sat beneath concrete, waiting. And Thomas Carver lived out his days in freedom, while Helen Mayfield remained entombed in darkness. Helen Mayfield was finally laid to rest on June 20th, 2009, 67 years after her murder. The funeral was held at St. Paul's Lutheran, the same church where she'd worshipped, the same church where she'd spent her last hours before Thomas Carver took her life. The sanctuary was packed beyond capacity. The pews overflowed with people, some standing along the walls, others sitting in folding chairs brought in to accommodate the crowd. Some attendees had known Helen personally, though they were few now. Elderly men and women in their 80s and 90s. Their memories of Helen faded but still present. Most of the attendees had never met Helen but had followed her story, had been moved by her tragedy, had felt compelled to pay their respects to a woman who'd been denied peace for far too long. The casket sat at the front of the church, simple pine with brass handles, covered with white lilies and roses. Inside, Helen's remains had been carefully arranged, treated with dignity and respect. She'd been given new clothes, a simple white dress, and her hands had been folded across her chest. The service was conducted by Reverend Michael Patterson, the current pastor of St. Paul's Lutheran, though not the same pastor who'd been there in 1942. Reverend Patterson spoke about justice delayed but not denied, about how God sees all things even when humans cannot, about how the truth always emerges eventually, no matter how deeply it's buried. He spoke about Helen's life, reading from the few records that remained, talking about her marriage to Robert, her quiet nature, her love of reading, her kindness to children. He did not mention Thomas Carver by name. There was no need. Everyone knew. Everyone understood. Elizabeth Keading, Ruth's daughter, gave a brief eulogy. She stood at the podium, her hands shaking slightly, her voice steady despite her emotion. She spoke about her mother's decades-long fight to keep Helen's memory alive, about Ruth's unwavering belief that the truth would eventually surface, about how Ruth had died without seeing justice but had never given up hope. "My mother knew," Elizabeth said, her voice filling the church. She knew that something terrible had happened to Helen. She felt it in her bones. And she never stopped fighting, never stopped writing letters, never stopped demanding answers. And today, finally, her fight has paid off. Helen has been found. Her killer has been identified. And she's finally being laid to rest with the dignity and respect she deserved 67 years ago. The congregation applauded softly, many wiping tears from their eyes. Detective Holt attended the funeral, standing at the back of the church as he'd done at Ruth Keading's funeral years earlier. He watched as the community came together to mourn a woman most of them had never met, and he was reminded once again of why he did this work. Not for the accolades, not for the headlines, not for the satisfaction of solving a difficult case, but for moments like this, for the knowledge that he'd brought closure to a family, justice to a victim, peace to a community. This was why cold cases mattered. This was why he dedicated his career to speaking for the dead. After the service, Helen's casket was carried to the Grand Island Cemetery by 6 pallbearers, all volunteers from the community. They walked slowly, solemnly, followed by a long procession of mourners. The cemetery was on the north edge of town, a peaceful place with tall oak trees providing shade and old headstones marking generations of Grand Island residents. Helen's grave had been prepared beside her husband Robert's, reuniting them after 68 years of separation. A simple headstone had been commissioned, made of gray granite, with Helen's name engraved in elegant script. Helen Marie Mayfield, April 3, 1914, to July 17, 1942, finally at peace. As Helen's casket was lowered into the ground, Reverend Patterson spoke a final prayer. He asked for God's mercy on Helen's soul, for comfort for those who mourned her, and for justice to be served in whatever form it takes. The mourners stood in silence, heads bowed, as the casket disappeared from view. When the ceremony ended, people lingered for a while, reluctant to leave, as if their presence could somehow make up for the 67 years Helen had spent alone in darkness. They laid flowers on the grave, dozens and dozens of bouquets, until the ground was covered in color and fragrance. And slowly, eventually, they drifted away, returning to their lives, carrying Helen's story with them. Detective Holt remained after everyone else had left. He stood at the foot of Helen's grave, his hands in his pockets, looking at the fresh earth and the flowers. He thought about the investigation, about the hours spent building the family tree, about the moment when Thomas Carver's name had emerged from the genealogical data, about the DNA match that had finally, definitively, proven Carver's guilt. He thought about how far forensic science had come, how cases that were once unsolvable could now be cracked open with technology that seemed almost miraculous. But he also thought about the victims, about the lives cut short, about the families left without answers, about the decades of pain and uncertainty. Technology was amazing, but it couldn't bring back the dead. It couldn't erase the suffering. It could only provide truth. And sometimes, truth was enough. Holt left the cemetery and drove back to his office. He filed the final report on the Mayfield case later that afternoon, 73 pages, detailing every aspect of the investigation, from the discovery of the remains to the DNA match, to the exhumation of Thomas Carver's body, to the final funeral and burial. It was one of the most comprehensive cold case reports he'd ever written, and certainly the most emotionally significant. When he finished, he placed the report in a folder, labeled it Helen Marie Mayfield, case closed, and filed it away. And that, he thought, was the last chapter in Helen Mayfield's story. But the ripples of the case continued to spread, wider and further than anyone could have anticipated. In the months following the resolution, several other cold cases in Nebraska were reopened, inspired by Holt's success with genetic genealogy. Investigators across the state began using the technique to identify suspects in decades-old murders, uploading DNA to public databases, building family trees, tracking down killers who thought they'd gotten away with their crimes. Some cases were solved within weeks. A 1976 murder in Lincoln, a 1982 abduction in Norfolk, a 1991 assault in Kearney. Others remained frustratingly out of reach. The DNA too degraded, the family trees too complex, the suspects already dead with no living descendants. But the Mayfield case had shown what was possible. It had proven that no case was truly cold, that technology could reach back through decades and pull truth from darkness, that justice could be served even after the killer had died. And that knowledge gave hope to families who'd been waiting years or even decades for answers. The case also sparked a broader conversation about unsolved disappearances, not just in Nebraska but across the country. How many other victims were out there, buried in unmarked graves, their stories forgotten, their killers walking free? How many other families were still waiting for answers, still wondering what happened to their loved ones? How many other cases could be solved if investigators applied modern techniques to old evidence? These questions haunted Detective Holt. They haunted the families of victims. They haunted everyone who'd followed the Mayfield case and understood its implications. But there was also hope. Hope that technology would continue to advance, that more cases would be solved, that more families would find closure. Hope that the dead would not be forgotten, that their voices would be heard, that their stories would be told. For Grand Island, the Mayfield case became a defining moment in the town's history, right up there with the tornado of 1980 that had destroyed part of the downtown, or the flood of 1993 that had devastated farmland for miles. It was a story that would be told and retold, passed down through generations, a reminder of a darker time when evil had walked among them undetected. It was a story of tragedy and perseverance, of a community that had been wounded but never gave up on one of its own. In the fall of 2009, the town council approved a memorial to be erected near the site where Helen's body had been found. The old Mayfield property had been sold again after the discovery of the remains, the housing development plans abandoned. No one wanted to build homes on land where a murder victim had been buried. The property sat empty for months, until finally, a local nonprofit purchased it with the intention of creating a small park. The memorial was unveiled on October 15, 2009. It was a simple stone marker, about 4 feet tall, made of the same gray granite as Helen's headstone. A bronze plaque was mounted on the front with an inscription that read, "In memory of Helen Marie Mayfield, 1914 to 1942, gone but never forgotten. May her story remind us to never stop seeking justice for those who cannot speak for themselves." The unveiling ceremony was attended by several hundred people. Detective Holt was there. Elizabeth Keading was there. Representatives from the Nebraska State Police were there, and survivors of other cold cases were there too, drawn by Helen's story, finding solidarity in shared pain and hope. Every year after that, on July 17th, the anniversary of Helen's disappearance and murder, residents of Grand Island gathered at the memorial to lay flowers and remember. It became a tradition, a ritual of remembrance. It wasn't just about Helen anymore. It became about all victims of violence, all those who'd been silenced, all those who waited for justice. The memorial became a place where people could come to grieve, to reflect, to recommit themselves to the belief that every life matters, that every victim deserves to be remembered, that justice should never be abandoned, no matter how much time has passed. And in a strange way, the memorial became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even after 67 years, the truth can still emerge, that even in the darkest moments, there is light, that evil may triumph for a time, but it never triumphs forever. Detective Marcus Holt continued to work cold cases for several more years after solving the Mayfield case. He applied genetic genealogy to dozens of investigations, solving some, hitting dead ends on others. He became something of an expert on the technique, teaching classes at the Nebraska Law Enforcement Training Center, consulting on cases in other states, speaking at conferences about the power and potential of DNA technology in solving cold cases. The Mayfield case remained his calling card, the case he was best known for, the case that proved what was possible when determination met technology. Holt retired from the Nebraska State Police in 2015 at the age of 48. He'd solved 72 cases over the course of his career, an impressive record by any measure. But the Mayfield case remained his most memorable, the one that had meant the most to him, the one that had reminded him why he'd become a detective in the first place. In his retirement speech, given at the state police headquarters in Lincoln, Holt spoke about Helen. Helen Mayfield waited 67 years for someone to find her, he said, his voice thick with emotion. 67 years in the darkness, alone, forgotten by most but not by all. There were people like Ruth Keading, who kept her memory alive, who refused to let her story die, who demanded answers even when no one was listening. There were investigators who refused to close the file, who kept evidence preserved, who believed that someday technology would advance enough to solve the case. And in the end, Helen got her justice. It took a long time. It took longer than it should have, but it came. The audience applauded. Some people cried. Holt's colleagues stood and gave him a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. When it finally ended, Holt stepped down from the podium and walked out of the building, ready to begin the next chapter of his life. But he never forgot Helen Mayfield. Her photograph sat on his desk at home for the rest of his life, a reminder of why his work had mattered, of the difference one person can make, of the importance of never giving up. In retirement, Holt wrote a book about his experiences solving cold cases. The book, titled Voices from the Grave: How Modern Science Solves Cold Cases, was published in 2017 by a major publisher. An entire chapter was devoted to the Mayfield case, walking readers through every step of the investigation, explaining the science behind genetic genealogy, and honoring Helen's memory. The book became a bestseller, reaching a national audience, introducing millions of people to Helen's story. Holt donated all his profits from the book to organizations that helped families of missing persons, believing that the money should go toward helping others find the answers he'd been fortunate enough to provide. Years later, in 2019, a documentary crew from a major network came to Grand Island to film a special on the Mayfield case. The documentary, titled The Silo: Helen Mayfield's 67-year Wait for Justice, featured interviews with everyone connected to the case. They interviewed Detective Holt, who walked the filmmakers through the investigation step by step, explaining how genetic genealogy had cracked the case wide open, How a third cousin match had led to Thomas Carver. How the exhumation and DNA comparison had provided irrefutable proof of guilt. They interviewed Ruth Keading, now 76 years old, her voice still strong despite her age. She spoke about her mother Ruth's decades-long crusade to keep Helen's memory alive, about Ruth's unwavering belief that justice would eventually be served, about how Ruth had died without seeing that justice, but had never lost hope. "I always knew something bad had happened to Helen," Elizabeth said, speaking her mother's words as if channeling her spirit. "My mother could feel it that morning when she walked into Helen's house. The wrongness of it, the emptiness, and she never let go of that feeling. She couldn't. She wrote letters for decades. She told Helen's story to anyone who would listen. She kept a file on the case, adding to it year after year, never giving up. Helen deserved better than to be forgotten. She deserved to be found. And thanks to my mother's persistence and Detective Holt's determination, she was." The documentary also featured interviews with Margaret Patterson, Thomas Carver's ex-wife, now 89 years old. She spoke about her brief marriage to Thomas, about the emotional walls he'd built, about the nightmares that had haunted him, about the emptiness in his eyes. She talked about the moment she'd seen him cry while watching a television show about a missing woman, about how she'd known then that he was carrying a terrible secret but had never imagined what that secret might be. "When I found out what he'd done," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face, "I felt physically sick. I'd been married to a murderer. I'd shared a bed with him, eaten meals with him, tried to love him. And all that time, he'd killed someone. He'd taken an innocent woman's life and buried her, and then just moved on as if it didn't matter. It haunts me still. I wonder sometimes if I could have done something, if I could have seen the signs, if I could have somehow prevented other potential victims. But I was young and naive, and I didn't know. I didn't know." The documentary crew also interviewed forensic experts who explained the science behind DNA extraction and genetic genealogy, breaking down complex concepts for a general audience. They explained how DNA can survive for decades under the right conditions, how epithelial cells under fingernails can preserve genetic material, how family trees can be built from third and fourth cousin matches in genealogy databases. They explained the ethics and controversies surrounding the use of public databases for law enforcement purposes, acknowledging the privacy concerns while also highlighting the potential for solving violent crimes. The documentary filmed at key locations around Grand Island. They showed the site where Helen's body had been found, now a small memorial park with green grass and walking paths, and the stone marker dedicated to her memory. They showed St. Paul's Lutheran Church, where Helen had attended her last service before being murdered. They showed the cemetery where Helen was buried beside her husband Robert. They showed the house where Ruth Keading had lived, though it was now occupied by a different family who'd agreed to let them film the exterior. The documentary aired on a major cable network in November of 2019. It was watched by millions of people across the United States and internationally. Social media exploded with reactions. People tweeted about Helen's story, shared the documentary on Facebook, discussed it on Reddit true crime forums. Helen's name trended on Twitter for 2 days. Her story reached a global audience, sparking conversations about cold cases, about genetic genealogy, about the importance of never giving up on victims, about how technology was changing the landscape of criminal justice. And once again, Helen Mayfield was remembered. Her name was spoken. Her story was told. She was not forgotten. The documentary had an unexpected effect. It inspired other cold case investigators around the country to take another look at their unsolved cases, to consider whether genetic genealogy might provide answers. In the year following the documentary's release, genetic genealogy was used to solve nearly 50 cold cases across the United States. Murders from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s were suddenly being cracked open. Families who'd waited decades for answers finally got them. And in each case, investigators cited the Mayfield case as inspiration, as proof that it could be done, as a template for how to approach these investigations. The technique wasn't perfect. There were limitations and challenges. Some cases had DNA that was too degraded to analyze. Some suspects had no living relatives in genealogy databases, making it impossible to build family trees. Some cases hit dead ends despite investigators' best efforts. And there were privacy concerns that needed to be addressed. Debates about whether it was ethical to use databases created for genealogical research for law enforcement purposes. But the potential was undeniable. Genetic genealogy was revolutionizing cold case investigations, giving investigators a powerful new tool, giving victims a chance to be heard even decades after their deaths. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic brought the world to a standstill. Businesses closed, schools went remote, hospitals overflowed, the death toll climbed. But even in the midst of a global crisis, cold case investigations continued. Detectives across the country, inspired by cases like Helen Mayfield's, kept working from home, kept searching databases, kept building family trees, kept fighting for victims who could no longer fight for themselves. The pandemic couldn't stop the pursuit of justice. If anything, it reinforced its importance. It reminded people how precious life is, how quickly it can be taken away, how important it is to seek truth and accountability. The Mayfield case had become more than just a solved murder. It had become a symbol of perseverance and determination, a symbol of how technology can be used for good, to bring light to darkness, to give voice to the silenced, a symbol of why cold cases matter, why we should never stop seeking answers, why every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed. Ruth Keading passed away in 2021, at the age of 98, just 1 year after her mother Ruth had died at the same age. She'd lived long enough to see Helen's case solved, long enough to attend Helen's funeral, long enough to know that her mother's lifelong fight had not been in vain. She'd lived long enough to see justice served, however delayed it had been. Her obituary, published in the Grand Island Independent, mentioned her role in preserving her mother's work on the Mayfield case. It described her as a tireless advocate for victims, as someone who'd carried on her mother's legacy, as a woman who believed deeply in the power of truth and the necessity of justice. At Elizabeth's funeral, someone read a letter she'd written years earlier, shortly after Helen's remains were found. The letter was addressed to Helen, though Helen could no longer read it. It was a message from one generation to another, from someone who'd never met Helen but had spent her life fighting for her. "Dear Helen," the letter began, and the church fell silent. "I never knew you, but I feel like I did. My mother spoke about you constantly. She told me about your quiet nature, your love of reading, your kindness to children. She told me about the night you disappeared, about the lights that stayed on all night, about the feeling of wrongness that she could never shake. She told me about her decades-long fight to find you, to bring you home, to ensure you weren't forgotten. I'm glad I lived long enough to see you found. I'm glad the truth finally came out. I'm glad Thomas Carver was exposed for what he was. You deserved so much more than what happened to you. You deserved to live a long, happy life. You deserved to heal from your grief, and find love again, and maybe have children and grow old. Thomas Carver stole that from you. He stole your future. He stole your voice. But he couldn't steal your memory. My mother made sure of that. And now, finally, you're at rest. Finally, you're home." There wasn't a dry eye in the church when the letter ended. People wept openly, moved by the message, by the connection between Ruth and Elizabeth and Helen that had spanned nearly 8 decades. The letter was later framed and placed at the memorial park dedicated to Helen, where visitors could read it and understand the depth of feeling that had driven Ruth Keading's crusade. Today, more than a decade after Helen's remains were discovered, the Mayfield case is studied in forensic science programs across the country. It's used as a case study in how genetic genealogy can solve seemingly impossible cases. Students examine the techniques used, the challenges faced, the ethical considerations involved. They study how a third cousin match led to the identification of a suspect who'd been dead for 12 years. They learn about the importance of preserving evidence, even in cases that seem unsolvable, because technology advances, and what's impossible today might be routine tomorrow. The case is also studied in criminal justice programs, used to teach students about the importance of persistence, about how investigators should never give up on victims, about how every case deserves to be investigated thoroughly, regardless of how much time has passed. Students read Detective Holt's report, analyzing his methodology, learning from his approach. They study how he managed the investigation, how he handled the media, how he worked with the forensic genealogist, how he brought the case to a successful conclusion despite the decades that had passed. Helen Mayfield's story is also taught in ethics classes, where students debate the use of genetic genealogy for law enforcement purposes. Is it ethical to use databases created for genealogical research to identify criminal suspects? What about privacy concerns? What about the rights of distant relatives who never consented to their DNA being used in criminal investigations? These are complex questions without easy answers, and Helen's case sits at the center of these debates, a real-world example of the technology's power and its potential problems. But beyond the academic interest, beyond the forensic techniques and the ethical debates, Helen's story remains fundamentally human. It's a story about a woman who was murdered, whose life was stolen from her, who spent 67 years buried in darkness waiting for someone to find her. It's a story about Ruth Keading, who refused to let her neighbor be forgotten, who fought for decades to keep Helen's memory alive. It's a story about Detective Marcus Holt, who used modern science to give Helen a voice, to expose her killer, to bring justice no matter how delayed. It's a story about a community that was wounded by Helen's disappearance and finally found healing when the truth emerged. And it's a reminder, a powerful reminder, that we should never stop searching for truth, never stop fighting for justice, never stop speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves. The Memorial Park in Grand Island has become a place of pilgrimage for people interested in true crime, for families of missing persons, for anyone who believes in the importance of justice. Visitors come from across the country, drawn by Helen's story, moved by what happened to her. They stand at the stone marker and read the inscription. They leave flowers, just as mourners did at Helen's funeral more than a decade ago. They take photographs. They reflect on the fragility of life, on the persistence of evil, on the power of truth. The park itself is beautiful. The nonprofit that purchased the property has transformed it from a place of horror into a place of peace. There are walking paths winding through trees. There are benches where people can sit and think. There are flower beds that bloom in spring and summer. And at the center, the stone marker dedicated to Helen, a permanent reminder of what happened here, of the woman who died here, of the justice that was finally served. Every July 17th, the anniversary gathering has grown larger over the years. What started as a small group of local residents has expanded to include hundreds of people. Some are from Grand Island, maintaining the tradition that started in 2009. Others travel from across Nebraska and even from other states. There are families of other murder victims, finding solidarity and hope in Helen's story. There are cold case investigators, paying respect to a case that inspired their own work. There are forensic scientists, grateful for a case that demonstrated the power of their field. There are students, learning about the case in their classes, wanting to see the site firsthand. The ceremony has become formalized over the years. It begins at 7 o'clock in the evening, around the time Helen would have left church on that July night in 1942. Reverend Patterson, or his successor, says a prayer. Someone reads a poem or a passage from literature. People share memories of Helen, or of Ruth Keading, or talk about other victims who are still waiting for justice. And then everyone lays flowers at the memorial, creating a carpet of color that lasts for days afterward. The gathering ends at sunset, just as it would have been getting dark on the night Helen was murdered. People stand in silence as the sun disappears below the horizon, thinking about Helen's last moments, about the terror she must have felt, about how she fought back, about how she never gave up, even as she was dying. And when darkness falls, people light candles, holding them up against the night, a symbol of light prevailing over darkness, of truth emerging from lies, of justice triumphing over evil. It's a powerful ceremony, a moving ceremony, and it ensures that Helen Mayfield will never be forgotten, that her story will continue to be told, that her name will continue to be spoken. In 2022, the Nebraska State Legislature passed a bill allocating additional funding for cold case investigations, specifically for the use of genetic genealogy and other advanced forensic techniques. The bill was nicknamed Helen's Law, in honor of Helen Mayfield, recognizing that her case had demonstrated the importance of using modern science to solve old crimes. The funding has allowed investigators across Nebraska to reopen dozens of cold cases, to send DNA for analysis, to hire forensic genealogists, to pursue leads that had been abandoned decades earlier. Several cases have already been solved thanks to this funding. A 1974 murder in Scottsbluff, a 1983 rape in Hastings, a 1995 abduction in Alliance. Each solved case brings closure to a family, answers to questions that have haunted them for years, justice to a victim who deserved better. And each case references the Mayfield investigation as the inspiration, as the proof that it could be done, as the template for success. Detective Marcus Holt, now in his mid-50s and enjoying retirement, was present at the signing ceremony for Helen's Law. He stood beside the governor as the bill was signed, witnessing the direct impact of his work, seeing how one case could change an entire state's approach to cold case investigations. Later, in an interview with a local news station, Holt spoke about what the law meant to him. "Helen's case showed us what's possible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It showed us that we should never give up on victims, that we should never close a case and forget about it, that we should always keep searching for truth. This law ensures that other victims will get the same chance Helen got. It ensures that investigators will have the resources they need to solve these cases. It ensures that families won't have to wait 67 years for answers. Helen's legacy is justice. And this law extends that legacy to countless other victims across Nebraska." The interview was watched by hundreds of thousands of people. It was shared widely on social media. And once again, Helen's name was spoken, her story told, her memory honored. As we approach the 15th anniversary of Helen's remains being discovered, her story continues to resonate. New books are written about the case, new podcasts discuss it, new documentaries explore it from different angles. Each retelling introduces Helen to a new generation, ensures that she remains part of the conversation about cold cases and forensic science and the pursuit of justice. And in Grand Island, the town that Helen called home, the town where she lived and died, the town that never forgot her, people still remember. They point out the cemetery where she's buried. They visit the memorial park. They tell their children and grandchildren about Helen Mayfield, about what happened to her, about how she was finally found, about why it matters. The story has become part of the town's identity, woven into its history, inseparable from its character. Grand Island is the town that never gave up on Helen Mayfield. The town where Ruth Keading fought for 67 years. The town where justice finally prevailed. And that's a legacy to be proud of. Helen's story is also a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that evil exists, that it can hide in plain sight, that someone you know and trust might be capable of terrible things. Thomas Carver wasn't a monster from a horror movie. He wasn't a serial killer who left a trail of bodies. He was an ordinary man, a farmhand, someone who worked hard and kept to himself and seemed unremarkable. But he was capable of murder. He was capable of looking people in the eye and lying. He was capable of living with a horrific secret for 54 years. That's the scariest part of Helen's story. Not the violence, though that's horrifying enough, but the ordinariness of her killer. The fact that he was just another person, indistinguishable from anyone else, capable of blending in and disappearing and living a normal life while carrying the weight of what he'd done. It makes you wonder, how many other Thomas Carvers are out there? How many other people are walking around with terrible secrets, with blood on their hands, with victims buried in places no one has thought to look? How many other cold cases could be solved if we applied the same determination and technology that solved Helen's case? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're important questions. Because if Helen's story teaches us anything, it's that we should never stop asking these questions, never stop searching for answers, never stop fighting for justice. If this case moved you, if Helen's story reminded you why cold cases matter, if you believe that every victim deserves to be remembered and every crime deserves to be solved, do me a favor, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to The Cold Case Desk. Share this video with someone who loves true crime and believes in justice. Drop a comment telling me which cold case you want us to investigate next. Your support keeps these stories alive. keeps these voices heard, reminds the world that no victim is ever truly forgotten. Thank you for watching, for caring, for believing that justice matters even when it's delayed. Until next time, keep searching for the truth. Keep fighting for those who can no longer fight for themselves. Keep believing that light will always find a way to pierce the darkness. This is the Cold Case Desk, reminding you that every victim has a story, every story deserves to be told, and every injustice demands to be answered. Helen Mayfield waited 67 years for justice, but she got it, and that gives us hope that others will too.